Hundreds of protests are underway or planned nationwide today in response to the deadly Minneapolis shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent.
What began as a single deadly encounter in Minneapolis has now erupted into a nationwide reckoning over power, accountability, and the future of federal law enforcement.
But where you see these cars coming now, last hour that was not the case. Many of these protesters were actually in the street blocking, or at the very least confronting, vehicles that were either coming out or into that federal facility. And you see sort of the law enforcement officers strategizing. They do seem to be going back at this point. Not sure the exact strategy, but you see them now retreating back. A big law enforcement presence. But again, as they swelled quickly, they seem to be shrinking back, but a show of force, no doubt, that these protesters do not seem to be intimidated for whatever reason. They are still yelling. They've gotten even louder.
The killing of Renee Good by an ICE agent ignited protests that spread far beyond Minnesota, tapping into years of unresolved anger, fear, and mistrust.
Louder. And so this just represents, I think, a little bit of the anger that we've seen in various parts of the Minneapolis area over the last few days since the day of the shooting, Fred.
And of course, we're not hearing the dialogue from the federal law enforcement there or any representation from, but just as you described, seeing them shrinking back, I wonder if that is simply representative of an attempt to de-escalate what is a very heightened, tenuous moment here.
It really is. I think it's hard to know their exact strategy, but depending on jurisdictions, for example, I'll compare what we just saw there with what we saw last night with local law enforcement out in the streets of downtown Minneapolis, where there was not a police presence at all, it seemed like, for portions of the protest. And then all of a sudden, we couldn't really look anywhere without seeing law enforcement at the state, local, and at the state and local level as well. So it was a little bit of a similar strategy here. And now you sort of see what has become the, the standard protection here at this point, Federal Protective Service police sort of guarding this entrance. But prior to this, when these vehicles were coming in and out of this federal facility, there was not any visible security presence, at least to what we're seeing right now. Now, it does seem that tempers have calmed a little bit, but as soon as they left, you see people are now getting right back into the street as well, and some of that similar posturing that we saw before federal law enforcement sort of had that show of force. So this is something, again, we've seen flare-ups here come in and out over the course of the day at various portions of entrances to this federal building. There was one that even a few days ago forced us to have to run because of an agent sprinting into the crowd to sort of arrest people. We haven't seen that here, but that's sort of the range of what we've seen. Crowd repellent used at points, pepper balls, and what protesters have done is at the most we've seen is throw snowballs as well. So that's kind of what we've been seeing here as cars sometimes honk in support.
Yeah, interesting moment, yet still very tense moment. Omar Jimenez will check back with you. Hundreds of protests are underway or planned nationwide today in response to the deadly Minneapolis shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent. Protests are already happening at a federal building near Minneapolis, where some ICE detainees have been held. And overnight, hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside a hotel they believe was housing federal agents. Police declared an unlawful assembly and arrested more than 24 people. And today, the mayor of Minneapolis urged demonstrators to keep the protests peaceful and warned that those who don't will be held accountable.
The vast majority of people have protested peacefully. To the few that have caused damage to property and or harm to others.
As crowds gathered outside federal buildings and in city streets across America, the response from Washington only deepened the divide. Claims, counterclaims, and conflicting narratives collided in real time, while communities demanded answers that have yet to arrive. Against this backdrop, reports of internal dissent within ICE itself have added a new and deeply controversial dimension to an already volatile moment. A city on edge. After a fatal encounter, Minneapolis has once again become the epicenter of national attention, not by choice, but by consequence. The shooting of Renee Good during an ICE operation immediately raised serious questions about the use of force and the presence of federal agents in local neighborhoods. Residents describe a city already carrying deep trauma from past incidents, now forced to relive it all over again. Protests formed quickly, not as isolated outbursts, but as an expression of collective grief and anger. Streets near federal facilities filled with chants demanding accountability, while many residents voiced fears that aggressive enforcement tactics were putting ordinary people at risk rather than protecting them. Conflicting narratives from federal and local leaders. Almost immediately, two very different stories emerged. Federal officials framed the shooting as an act of self-defense during a dangerous encounter, while local leaders urged caution and called the use of deadly force reckless and unnecessary. Minneapolis officials emphasized the need for an independent investigation, pointing out discrepancies between official statements and publicly available video footage. This clash of narratives fueled public mistrust, with many asking why federal authorities appeared so quick to justify lethal action before all facts were known. The gap between what residents saw and what they were told only intensified calls for transparency. Protests grow as tensions escalate. As days passed, demonstrations expanded in size and intensity. Protesters gathered outside federal buildings, hotels believed to house agents, and major intersections. While most protests remained peaceful, emotions ran high, and confrontations occasionally flared as law enforcement vehicles entered and exited secured areas. Observers noted a pattern of sudden shows of force followed by strategic pullbacks, suggesting uncertainty even among authorities about how to manage the situation. The visible anger was not just about one incident, but about a broader sense that communities were being policed without consent or accountability. Federal presence and the show of force. The heavy federal law enforcement presence became a focal point in itself. Armored vehicles, tactical gear, and tightly coordinated movements sent a clear message of authority, but not necessarily reassurance. Many protesters interpreted the show of force as intimidation rather than protection. Journalists on the ground reported moments when officers appeared to retreat, possibly in an effort to de-escalate, only for tensions to rise again once they pulled back. This push and pull created a volatile atmosphere, reinforcing fears that aggressive tactics were escalating rather than calming the situation. The role of video evidence in shaping public opinion. Footage from the scene of the shooting circulated rapidly, analyzed frame by commentators, legal experts, and ordinary citizens. While the video does not show every angle, many viewers argue it contradicts claims that officers were in immediate danger. The positioning of the vehicle, the timing of the shots, and the behavior of agents before the shooting have all been scrutinized. In an era where visual evidence often carries more weight than official statements, these videos have become central to the public's skepticism toward federal explanations. Political rhetoric fuels the fire. Rather than calming tensions, statements from national leaders often poured fuel on an already burning fire. Harsh language describing protesters and the victim herself hardened divisions and shifted focus away from accountability. Critics argue that framing dissent as extremism serves a political purpose, allowing the administration to justify harsher measures while dismissing legitimate concerns. Supporters, meanwhile, echoed claims that law enforcement is under siege. This rhetorical war has transformed a local tragedy into a national political battleground, where facts risk being overshadowed by ideology. Internal dissent within ICE comes into focus. Amid the chaos, reports began to surface, suggesting deep unrest within ICE itself. While claims that thousands of agents have surrendered their weapons or walked out remain unverified, multiple former and current officials have acknowledged growing discomfort with the agency's direction. Some agents reportedly feel caught between orders from above and the reality on the ground, worried that aggressive tactics are endangering both civilians and officers. Even the suggestion of internal resistance underscores how serious the moment has become, hinting at fractures within an institution under intense pressure. Experts warn of militarization risks. Former federal agents and security experts have voiced alarm at what they describe as the increasing militarization of immigration enforcement. They point out that many ICE operations are based on civil, not criminal warrants, requiring restraint and minimal force. When tactics escalate rapidly, the risk of tragic outcomes rises. Experts stress that treating civilians as hostile threats undermines public trust and places officers in unnecessarily dangerous situations. These warnings add credibility to calls for a full, independent review of enforcement practices nationwide. Local officials push back. Minnesota leaders have taken an unusually firm stance, openly challenging federal accounts and demanding access to evidence. The mayor and governor have repeatedly urged calm while insisting that justice requires transparency. They have warned against federal overreach and called on residents not to give in to provocation. This balancing act, supporting peaceful protest while maintaining public safety, reflects the difficult position local governments face when federal actions spark unrest within their communities. Nationwide solidarity takes shape. What began in Minneapolis quickly spread to cities across the country. Demonstrators in New York, Boston, and beyond gathered not only in solidarity with Renee Good's family, but also to send a broader message. Many protesters said they were acting preemptively, warning against similar tactics being brought into their own neighborhoods. This nationwide response suggests a growing movement that sees the incident as symbolic of deeper systemic problems rather than an isolated tragedy. The question of accountability. At the heart of the unrest lies a simple but unresolved question: who will be held accountable? Calls for independent investigations have grown louder as trust in internal reviews diminishes. Critics argue that when federal agencies investigate themselves under political pressure, confidence in the outcome is compromised. Until clear answers are provided, protests are unlikely to fade. Accountability, many argue, is the only path toward restoring faith in institutions meant to serve the public. Fear, anger, and the human cost beyond politics and policy. There is a human story that risks being lost. A woman is dead, a family is grieving, and a community is once again forced to confront violence tied to authority. Protesters describe fear not just for undocumented immigrants, but for citizens who find themselves caught in aggressive enforcement actions. This emotional undercurrent explains why demonstrations have remained intense even when numbers fluctuate. What this moment reveals about power. The events unfolding reveal a broader struggle over how power is exercised in America. When enforcement relies on fear rather than trust, resistance becomes inevitable. The visible tension between federal agents, local officials, and communities highlights a system under strain. Whether this moment leads to reform or further escalation depends largely on how leaders choose to respond in the days ahead. A nation at a crossroads. America now stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward transparency, restraint, and renewed trust between communities and those tasked with protecting them. The other risks deeper polarization, where every protest is met with force and every tragedy becomes a political weapon. The response to the Minneapolis shooting will likely shape the national conversation on immigration enforcement and civil liberties for years to come. What comes next? As investigations continue and protests persist, the country watches closely. Will facts be allowed to speak louder than rhetoric? Will dissent be treated as a democratic right rather than a threat? These questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that this moment has exposed fractures that can no longer be ignored. How they are addressed will determine whether healing is possible or whether division deepens further.